welcome to this show on Budget Evening. I'm going to go right to my panelists, and it's a pleasure for me to have all of you with me right here. I'd like to introduce my panelists today, Ms. Bharti Gupta-Ramola. She's, of course, Markets Leader, PwC India. I've got Dr. Shambhika Ravi, Brookings India. She's with us right here. Ameera Shah, CEO, Metropolis Healthcare. Wonderful to have you here. Pushpa Bector at DLF Utilities, of course. And, of course, we have Pratibha Jain, partner at Nishit Desai. Thank you very much for coming on to the show this evening. We've heard a lot about the budget all day, and of course at this hour in the evening, after all the dust is settling, and this is still before we've really looked into the fine print, I'm going to ask my panelists, do you think this was a balanced, growth-oriented budget? And I'm going to start with you, Ms. Bharti.
So I think I'll comment on it in two ways. I think as far as taxation is concerned, it's a very grounded, very responsive to industry asks budget. There's a lot of detail in it. It's very, very focused on doing things that are necessary to make all the things that the government has done in the last couple of years work. So I think there are a lot of people are really quite happy to see the detail of what has been done.
And interesting, you use the word grounded. I'm going to come back on that itself. Mr. Ameera, what are your thoughts coming from where you are in the
private sector? From two perspectives. I think first perspective being from the business and citizen of the country. I think it's a fair budget. Having said that, I think there are 2 or 3 areas which they could have taken much stronger stands on, which I think there's been a little bit of an eyewash. And those are areas that I think I'm not particularly happy with. Coming from the healthcare industry, I think it's a sore disappointment. Pretty much healthcare has again been completely ignored, which I think is a slightly sad thing because it's a social fabric of the country and really needs to be addressed. I mean, today it is the biggest bankrupting force in the country.
Okay. Ms. Pratibha, wish list achieved or not at
significantly, yes. Some of the harder bullets that could have been bitten, like doing away with proposed poem or GAR, both have been deferred but not done away with. But a lot of the other things on the wish list have been included. I think I agree with Bharti. A lot of the inputs from the industry have been considered and included in certain respects, which means they listened, they discussed, they listened, and came up with it. And no sudden surprises, which we've had in the recent past, which is always
so no disasters.
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Bector, coming to you from a retail perspective. Give me a sense first. I'm digressing a little bit from my original question. Right. There were some fears you must have heard about in this budget. What was your reaction when you finally got over that stage?
Talking to people, the word out on the street was the service tax would go right up to 18% as a roadmap to GST. Well, with that, they've just increased by 0.5%, and post a debate it's going to be gazetted as an order. So I think that will be a sigh of relief for most of the retailers. It's at 15% at best. Apart from that, I think it's a broad-based budget. Okay. The budget is clearly one which has taken into account infrastructure. The focus on infrastructure is very, very clear. I'm especially impressed with the fact that there are 10,000 kilometers of roadways on the national highways they're going to commit to creating in FY17, which is good. That in turn will have a long-term impact, good impact on retail and retail real estate. But specifically to my industry, which is retail real estate, REITs will now be possibly a reality with the DDT getting exempt. That will be a reality, and that's good news for us.
And Ms. Shambhika, I want to, of course, first of all, just remind our viewers, she was on a panel for the budget with me a year ago. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because you've had a lot of time to really reflect upon what was perhaps not ideal at that stage, and I understand you've already been publishing in terms of what's happened so far. What is your view on this particular budget?
After 2 very disappointing budgets from this government, I call this budget, actually I'm quite happy with this budget. But I call this a marginal revolution budget because they really have stuck to fundamentals and small revolutions. Like giving statutory backing to Aadhaar is going to expand, efficiency in scope and scale. They're going to be able to link it to many other, efficiency enhancing measures, not just in subsidies, but also regularly, mainstream markets. The emphasis on infrastructure, particularly in terms of capex in railways, in airports, in roads, these are all excellent. Emphasis on agriculture, distress has been a concern. So the kind of investments that they have planned to make over the next 1 year in agriculture, I'm actually quite happy with that as well.
And there's a change in that dialogue.
There is a change in that dialogue. But I think I go back to the comment on the healthcare, is that they have largely stuck to insurance. And I have been writing against this for a while, that, a financial instrument is only as good as the infrastructure that backs the financial instrument. So as long as, we shy away from really addressing those issues of access and delivery of healthcare, financial instruments are very limited.
And I want to bring in Ms. Ameera on that, because you said you're strongly disappointed with it. Give me a sense as to what your reaction is. That's exactly what she was talking about.
Exactly right. I mean, today the biggest issue we have in most towns and villages is there is no primary care.
Right.
Primary centers are either not manned, there's no equipment, people are having to travel kilometers to go and get simple things done. Unless you figure out a way to attract doctors to primary care centers, you will not have medical treatment in smaller towns and smaller villages, which is where the biggest problem is. So unless we build the health infrastructure, and today I'll give you a simple example, 70% of the Indian infrastructure for healthcare is owned by the government, but it provides only 30% of actual healthcare in the country, which tells you have all this excess capacity and infrastructure sitting there, and because of manning and equipment and funding and processes, it's not used. So is there a way that we could really use this infrastructure to provide better healthcare to people? Because you give them insurance, great, but where are they going to get the services?
And that, of course, is a disservice in the long run.
But Fatima, we have to be very careful. This is the finance minister's job. Yeah. But the kind of changes that we felt Modi government would bring about really requires the higher education ministry, which is the HRD, requires the health ministry to come up with a blueprint. So when we say there's a shortage of doctors, I don't think Arun Jaitley can do much about it.
So this is what I want to ask you, and I'd like all of you to respond, because the budget, of course, becomes the event that it is. But at the end of the day, look at what it is actually supposed to be projecting. What is the instrument that it really is? So has this budget sort of also really come back to that particular message itself? Yeah.
I believe it has, yeah.
I think it's much more broad-based.
Okay.
It's not just focused on tax slabs, which is what we discussed. The 80% of discussion used to be. Today, if you see the kind of announcement on the regulatory side, on the policy side that they have announced, even stuff like increasing the limits for stock exchange investments from 5 to 15%, they did it in the budget. So, small regulatory issues, insurance companies being allowed under automatic route, long-standing requirement of the industry for the financial services sector. Earlier it was limited to 18. They've said they'll open it broadly to the regulated businesses. So to that extent, a lot of deep dive into the issues we've been talking about, that the investors have been facing, the businessmen have been facing. Talk about this, the micro reforms. It's not just about macro. They've shown fiscal prudence by limiting, the fiscal deficit to 3.5%, and they've provided a lot of micro stuff. So to that extent, from a budget, I'm quite happy.
So I think the question that one needs to ask is whether this fiscal target is achievable. I mean, I really haven't read the whole thing, but the sense one has is that the numbers are achieved because there's an assumption on the price of oil, and there's an assumption on what the government can take away in terms of the difference between the pump price and the price of oil. And then, the amount of recapitalization of banks is fairly limited. So therefore, you really have to ask yourself how much of this is, and I think there are probably some assumptions on the 7th Pay Commission, how much the payout will actually be. So, I mean, if you take all that into account, then the really question becomes on, are we going to be really dependent on what happens with oil price or any of these things to actually achieve the fiscal target? I think that's going to be a real challenge for this government going forward. So I think it's a great objective to have. What we will see during the year will depend a lot on this. And the second thing I would say is, at the moment, company balance sheets are over leveraged, and banks have very little ability to lend because of the NPA situation. where is the growth going to come from?
Well, that's the question.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's the question, which is, sorry to interrupt, and I want you to continue with what you were saying, which is the basic question is, and perhaps it's misplaced on some level, but it's like, does a budget, can it actually propel a push into investment cycles? Right? I mean, I think that's one thing that we're really looking to answer here. So I just want you to carry on with what you were saying there.
I mean, if you look at what the potential NPAs could be, right, we're talking about potentially it being 10, 15x of what's being provided. At the same time, the government says we're going to stand behind all the PSU banks. And exactly as she said, I mean, if tomorrow it comes to the situation where the write-offs and the provisions are much higher, what do you do in that case? And where is it going to come from? The second point I wanted to make was that I noticed that in the list, there was almost 12 or 13% of the revenue is actually being spent on one area, which is on not subsidies but money given to gram panchayats. So almost something like 280,000 crores is being given to gram panchayats. My only question is, you're giving it to gram panchayats for development rurally, which is fantastic, which is what should happen. But how do we ensure this doesn't become another dole or a subsidy that goes straight down to people, leading back to food inflation, which is what we had a few years ago?
Okay, okay, and I want you to comment on that.
Well, so it's going to the gram panchayat as well as the urban local bodies in combination. And frankly, I think it's a great move, largely because, you know, we have huge variation. I mean, devolution is a great idea, fiscal federalism, more power. But eventually you'll have divergence. Some states are going to do very well, some are going to go back further. And in that sense, if you devolve further from the state to the cities or the gram panchayat, that divergence is going to increase as well.
Okay.
So, you know, when we have smart cities and we pick out 20 cities, there are lots of bitter mayors and you know, local urban body governments who just do not have the capacity and they don't know how to compete. So some of this transfer is really meant to build that capacity at the local level for them to go out and create the kind of, you know, governance, infrastructure to be able to compete. So I frankly think it's a good move, because while NREGA might have been a dole, but it has also balanced, it has led to increase in demand, it has really led to stability, because the counterfactual is we might have had an upheaval in the rural areas, which we haven't.
Were you looking at that? Ms. Pratibha, I want to come to you because we were talking about this particular issue itself.
Exactly, and I think, and the fact that, you know, this is the highest allotment to NREGA ever, I think, you know, in terms of stimulating growth, you know, there is some talk about not there being enough for the middle class, but, you know, everywhere else I think they've got it covered. And just, you know, quickly on the capitalization of banks, I think, you know, Mr. Sinha did cover that. He said, apart from, you know, if they need more, we will see. I'm glad they didn't do that here. They said if we need more, we'll see, but they're looking at other options, strategic sales, different investments. You know, even if they just list the National Stock Exchange, there's 10,000 crore that can go to PSUs just from that. So, you know, I would rather they bite the bullet on you know, some of these other measures, you know, merger of the banks, consolidation there, than, you know, start just recapitalization and taking it from the tax money.
In this particular budget, I don't think the government's focused on announcing some large SOPs or creating.
It's a different animal altogether.
It's a different animal. They have really said, listen, I have talked about a few things during my election manifesto, which is housing for all. And by going for that 2022 housing target, and affordable housing at that, and I think it's a very good move, because as you know, in China that happened, most of the BRIC countries it's happened, that when housing gets a boost at the affordable housing level, there's a lot of boost that happens around it. The economy gets a boost, employment is generated, and hence a series of ripple effects happen. So it's not something that they have done which will have a direct, immediate impact, but it will have a long-term impact over the next 2 years. And that, I think, is a good move.
So then that goes back to what we were talking about.
Of course, looking at affordable housing is, and they have announced SOPs for affordable housing, which is very good, you know, which is
a really good example of what, you know, of a particular area where the government's been very specific about what can get done, which will stimulate growth. So they've done a whole bunch of things around affordable housing. And I guess the question that, you know, one has been asking oneself is, so what have they done with the Make in India? What have they done with the Startup India? And are those measures the right measures to make some of those things happen? And I think in some ways, you know, as you read the fine print, you can begin to see what will actually support all these things that the government wants to do, and where there's going to be more needed to be done.
So I think, sorry to interrupt that, and let's come back to this point, but the word fine print, of course, is one that we always talk about, right? But especially after an evening like this, it's going to take a while for people to really look for specifics that they're looking at. I want to get a sense from each of my panelists as to what are the sort of, when we talk about fine print, what are you really going to be looking at tomorrow? I'm going to start with you, Shavika.
Well, I'm actually glad they didn't go out for a big bang bailout of the banks.
Yeah.
Because there's a reason the banks are in the situation they're in. And while we believe that political interference and all of that put aside, there is certain due diligence which was compromised. And, as a big believer in incentive compatibility and moral hazard, I think this amount of 25,000, while it's meant to really drive them towards mergers or some kind of consolidation in the banks, but for Make in India, for Startup India, Stand Up India, all of these will require credit growth.
Sure.
So we do not want, again, to have a replay of the PPPs that we had over the, UPA 2. But we are very close to it. So the banks really have to be tightened so that these schemes don't fall in the same...
And you talked about how some of them have to fail, and you basically also talked about consolidation, right?
Yes, mergers,
that's what you're aiming at right now.
Absolutely. The poor performing ones must get acquired by the better performing ones. Otherwise, we go back and make the same mistake. And this really turns into a contagion because it takes generations to instill discipline in the credit markets. So, a bad performing bank can be very damaging.
And we've seen that.
And we've seen that. And we don't want to see that again.
I'm sorry I interrupted what Ms. Pushpa was saying earlier, but what I was talking about was a specific fine print that everybody's really looking at, just to get a sense as to, what is it that you're really sort of...
Well, anything that will reduce consumption at the urban centers, I would be looking out for that, because apparel, branded apparel, they have increased excise duties, and that will go up by 2 to 5%. Now that's not going to be too much of a game changer. However, one will need to see what have they done to the other aspect of consumption. So that's one thing that I would look out for.
Increase the advertisement cost for e-commerce.
That's true.
Shoes and clothes affect
shoes and clothes. Well, the ripple effect of service tax increase would be that people will watch out where they eat and how much they eat. And
yes, of course.
There has been a lot of study done on how restaurant eating out has reduced because of increase in inflation on one level. On the other hand, also the service tax and the multiple taxes that come to you.
So I think for me, whether they're able to get the bankruptcy code passed, if they're able to get GST through, they've announced a few measures for revival of the corporate bond market. Very, very important, in terms of, where you're going to get funding for your industries to go, Make in India, all of that. You need the corporate bond market, the private bond markets to grow. I think I read, and now I have to see the fine print that
our favorite word, the fine print, as a lawyer.
But debt securities, they're allowing unlisted debt securities to be held by foreign investors. So, the stimulation there that they might have provided is going to be very important.
Ms. Ameera, coming to you.
One of the things when we were watching the FM's speech and he was explaining sort of the budget, and one of the things he mentioned was on the cleanup that he's tried to do in this budget, whether it was dispute resolution, whether it was taxation, whether it was black money, simplification. And he's talked a lot about how he's tried to overhaul the tax regime in this country, which is a big statement, and I genuinely hope it's what's intended. I think the fine print there would be very important to see whether they've really simplified things to make it much easier sort of as we go forward.
Let me add just one quickly there is on, recently we incorporated a company in 3 days, from 3 weeks to 3 days, and today he announced that they're going to move towards 1 day. I think that can be a game changer.
Stuff like that will be fantastic. So I think there are really two sort of things when you talk about fine print, Fatima. One is the detail of what the taxation is, what actually specifically is being said about things. But I think the other one is that this budget, when you quickly read it, there's so many administrative actions that he's talking about. I think so in the next few days it will be interesting to see how those are actually being executed. So there's a lot about how there's going to be a lot of things done through information technology in terms of this whole cleanup thing that you're talking about, the ease of doing business, etc. and how these actually get executed and implemented is in some ways,
and that is what
going to be exciting.
We come back exciting, and also that's also the credibility factor that comes.
And that actually links to the point. Actually, one thing which I found very interesting in the highlights was mentioned saying that we want to track the outcome of every scheme and report on it.
Right.
And it's very interesting because for all of us who run private businesses or publicly listed businesses, what do? Right? We make plans and then we monitor and we track and we check whether we've achieved things.
And you'd like for that to be
We'd
the
like
case
the government,
with the government
to do that.
as well.
If that can be a transparent output, result-oriented scheme, you know, we'll be the happiest people in the world if they manage to actually accomplish everything.
Which is accountability and transparency within the system of what has been announced as well. Just to come back to the business environment itself, and I'm going to go to Ms. Ameera on this because of what your profile is. I want to ask you what the key challenges you think have been, or are. Forget what's not been coming in from the government at this stage. But I'm asking you that when you on a budget day, for example, you still have a perspective as to what is really needed on the ground and how things are being run at this stage. Give me a sense as to what you feel that is going to be going forward, because we've all been talking about the global scenario and where India is and how things are, but on the ground we're seeing what's happening on a corporate level as well. I just want to ask you how things are looking on that front.
I think the biggest challenges that at least we face in healthcare specifically is skill and talent. It's a huge issue. Today you get people who are graduates, but frankly you can't even if you hire them, you can't put them on the job immediately at all, because they're employable, but you're not able to actually use them immediately. So the level of skill and the level of training that's required, I think, in our people to actually get us to be productive, efficient workhorses, I think is a big challenge. Today we've got 1,000 centers, but to man these 1,000 centers across all these different countries, to send people to those small towns, I'm even talking about tier 3 towns, to send people to tier 3 towns to say I'm willing to live there, doctors, technicians, and I'm actually willing to do a job, there is a challenge, right? And the cost of actually able to send these people is huge, and you can't charge the same prices locally in rural India. So we're in this constant conflict of not being able to provide services that we would like to provide because they're too expensive and they can't be affordable locally.
So that's a gritty, real answer in terms of what's happening on the ground. I want to come to you, Ms. Pushpa, because I want to get a sense from you as to, we're talking about ways to really spur consumption. We're talking about the global growth scenario. We're looking at the figures that have been coming out lately. Give me a sense as to what you see, because we keep talking about India being a glimmer of hope, and how this budget is, of course, talking about, being a credible budget and sort of being a responsible budget. Give me a sense as to where that fits within the immediate picture on the ground for someone who's as connected as you are to all sorts of aspects of growth and consumption.
Well, what we see in the malls business especially is that consumption has been on a steady increase. There was a bit of stagnancy last year, but this year I noticed that again, there is steady increase. I wouldn't say it's spurted up. What we, forget to mention is that in a world where everything, the GDP is negative in most spaces or static, we have been growing at 7.5%, and I don't think we mentioned that enough, and it is an achievement that we are providing a certain stable GDP growth, which is good. How does this translate into great consumption? Well, I see this with coming up only with great infrastructure boost. If infrastructure, that's happening as we speak, but more needs to happen. I don't think it's happened enough. More needs to happen in urban pockets, especially. I think infrastructure is something that we are struggling with. If there is planned infrastructure, planned urban planning that would get set into place, that will propel. Believe it or not, it will propel consumption, because most people decide to go out or experience a great shopping center based on not just the brands that are in there, but also how quickly they can reach that spot. So to us, that's a very, very important aspect that the government needs to take care of.
Ms. Bharti, just coming back to you on the whole front, because we're looking at an overall scenario over here. What is it that you would like to really see going forward? You've talked about the execution and how you're going to actually see the services carry on from now. But what is it that you're really looking for in the next few days?
I think what is really going to be important is how we can facilitate investment.
Yeah.
Because I think the fiscal deficit target will be good to be able to attract investment. And it's critical that we are able to attract investment because we don't have enough domestic savings to invest, and our banks don't have enough, capital to support investment. So how this budget stimulates investment, I think, is going to be quite interesting to watch. And then, of course, we've talked about domestic demand. I'm hoping all this focus on agriculture, affordable housing, etc., will give a fillip to rural demand, which is something which is, had promised a lot a few years ago and then had sort of become quite tepid. So if that goes up, I think that will be another very, very fascinating thing to watch.
I'd like to step in here. I agree with what you're saying. Also, I think the two standouts is the fact that they have announced Stand Up India as a scheme. They've announced the fact that there will be 2 to 3 million entrepreneurs that they're going to be promoting. Now that, if they are able to achieve, along with the skill development, these two things can propel a whole new generation of skilled workforce and entrepreneurs and startup entrepreneurs on the other. I think that will have an interesting play, but there's nothing in the budget which is immediate. It's slightly more long term.
Okay. So actually on the startup piece, I'm not sure it's it's saying the right things, but anyway, I'll let
they have provided, exemption from income tax for startup companies. So, that should be very welcome to that whole entrepreneur environment.
The only question is how many people make profits in the first few years. So
and also as an entrepreneur, you never start a business thinking I'm going to save tax in the first year.
That's not where you're
start
going,
a business to create value.
I mean, that's not the to be fair, I think there's also reduction in the compliance requirements. They're trying to make things easy. But again, while we're putting a lot of faith in Startup India, the crux, the big supply constraint we have is the skill that she mentioned. And here I actually see something nice in this budget, which is a movement away from this whole idea of top-down skill development. That just because the IT sector was able to do it, by the way, which happens to be very standardized.
Can you apply it everywhere else?
Yeah.
We're
not going to be able to do that.
True.
So now this time, for the first time, I noticed there is incentivization for employment generation. When they say that the Provident Fund, the Employee Provident Fund, there's going to be support for that, all of those are great because I think the best training is really on the shop floor or while you're employed. So if you really had to pay less to an untrained so-called person and you did the training, I think that's how markets eventually evolve.
Sure. So actually there's a bunch of things for employing more. So there's the thing on, the pension contribution, there's something on a certain multiplier of the cost being deductible. There's quite a bit on encouraging employment, which is, but in manufacturing. So I don't know if it applies to you.
No, but I'm saying whether manufacturing or services, what would be part of ease of doing business would be to say that once we've hired these people, like I'll tell you what's been happening the last 3 years. Every 4 months, the labor rules change.
Sure.
Right? Minimum wage goes up. Bonus Act changes,
absolutely,
which has happened now. Provident, something changes. So you're constantly.
So you need the consistency anyway, even within the business.
Right, because what is the opposite, right? You need to be able to catch your risk to be able to predict any sort of consistency.
Sure. And Mr. Aditya, I'm going to come to you on this because overall, look at the conversation we're having right here, which is the realities on the ground and also what you're projecting to the outside world. You speak a lot to investors who would be coming into India. What do you think this budget would really project to them at this stage? And also, I'm not saying that this is really the ultimate, platform for it. I mean, this is really not. It's not. Things are happening over the year. There are policy changes. A lot of the really important things are going to be away from the budget. Sure. But give me a sense as to what you think, your particular conversations are going to be, given what we've seen, without the fine print, I must say. Disclaimer.
I think, given where the global economy is and given the Indian fundamentals are good, we are all having these conversations where people are saying India can be the one shining economy in an otherwise gloomy East Asia.
The glimmer.
Right? Yes. And for that, the fact that they've shown fiscal prudence, perception is important. Let's see, in today's markets, global economy, perception is important. The fact that they showed that they can be fiscally prudent I think it's very good. It's going to lead to good conversations. I think the focus on infrastructure and investments is again very good.
It's a solid
projection. The fact that they have tried, though I don't think the retrospective tax amendment, solving the litigations goes far enough by just waiving off penalties and interest. I think the investors will say they could have kept it a little more open in terms of allowing discussions on principles. But be as it may, there is, like I said before, there is nothing that is drastically wrong that they came out with as far as foreign investors and boosting investment by foreign investors is concerned. They've opened up sectors. The ones I mentioned, like the financial services, is an important sector. It goes unnoticed, but none of the foreign mutual funds have really done well in India, per se.
True.
Because the sector's always been closed to foreign investors. So, small stuff, but, listening to the industry and opening it up further and further, all of that is the right message. But I think the key is really what everybody's talking, how if the fundamental growth is not there, and if they're not able to achieve fundamental growth, what we're seeing today is investments in only certain sectors. Healthcare is hot, e-commerce is hot, any of the unregulated, anything that touches retail, F&B is hot. But that's not the whole economy. So if you want to get investment back into infrastructure, NIF needs to be successful. That's post-budget. A lot of the announcements they have made today, the PPPs need to work. The dispute resolution, the fine print again will be what is it that they're proposing in the dispute resolution for PPPs that they've announced. I think overall for foreign investors, positive discussions for us in the next few days.
And let's not forget about what's happening anyway in terms of the global economy, and of course all the uncertainties that we're looking at in terms of the global fundamentals. Did you want to come in on something, because I believe we're out of time?
We pat ourselves on the back for the 7.75%, but we are very poor. So that is expected of a poor country which has just basic infrastructure in place. That's the kind of growth we should expect.
Sure.
I mean, there's a reason China is where it is. Within such a short span, they're a middle-income country. So we need this kind of sustained growth.
So you need to keep that realistic trajectory in your head.
Yes.
I believe that we're running out of time here. If there's anything that any of my panelists want to just close off with on this particular moment, I just want to say that it's been wonderful talking to you. And this, of course, was a panel of mixed backgrounds in terms of what you brought to it. But thank you so much for having been part of this on Budget Evening.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.